today's gospel, we hear about Jesus raising his friend Lazarus from the dead. And what's interesting to me about this gospel is that before he actually raises Lazarus from the dead, he talks about how he will raise him even before he gets to the tomb. And I'd just like to read a little bit of the passage for you. He is in Nazareth with his disciples, and they send word to Jesus that his friend is very ill. And Jesus tells them, "This illness is not unto death, it is for the glory of God." So he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And then a few days later, he actually goes to see Lazarus, and he has already died. And so they come to him, his sisters, and says, if he would have been here, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus says, "You know, I'm going to raise people from the dead." And she says, "Of course I know that. You know, you're Christ, the Son of God." But he sees Lazarus' sister Mary weeping, and he takes time to grieve the loss of his friend. And the verse exactly in the Bible says, it's the shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35, literally just says, "Jesus wept." And the Jews said, "See how he loved him." And so they're questioning, why doesn't he raise him from the dead? But just a few verses later, he does raise him from the dead. So that's what I want us to think about this week, is just how even though Jesus knows that he's about to raise his friend Lazarus from the dead, he still stops and takes time to grieve his loss. And sometimes we get very busy, wrapped up in life, that we don't actually take time to grieve the losses. Sometimes that's just because it's too painful to deal with. And sometimes we have this idea that if we grieve, it means we don't have hope. But we can grieve with hope. Of course, Jesus did. And he knew 5 minutes later he was going to raise his friend from the dead, you know. The grief didn't stop him from doing the Father's will, but it's very human. And the Lord wants to be with us in that grief, and he wants to show us that it is holy and that it is good. So maybe think of some ways or some times this week that you can stop and take time to grieve, either a difficult situation at work, where there was a loss that maybe you couldn't deal with in the moment. Come back to it later so that you can ask the Lord to come into it and to grieve it with you. You don't ever have to grieve alone. He's already gone through that with his very, very close friend who he knew he was going to raise in a couple of moments, because it's something that's necessary for us. And we can grieve with hope, knowing that the grief is not the end. We do have Christ in the resurrection, but we can invite Christ in those moments because he wants to be there with us. So how can you take time to grieve this week? Or how can you be with another person in their grief and grieve with them just as Christ grieves with us?